Jonathan Hadley lived a quiet, deliberate life on the outskirts of a growing suburban neighborhood. His family-owned field, a sprawling patch of land filled with wildflowers and gently swaying grass, was his sanctuary. Passed down from his late father, it wasn't just a piece of property, it was a connection to his roots. Jonathan loved walking the field early in the morning, watching the sunrise spill golden light over the expanse. It was a stark contrast to the sterile suburban development creeping closer every year, with its identical houses, manicured lawns, and strict neighborhood regulations. Jonathan had always managed to keep his distance from it all, preferring the solitude and freedom his land afforded him. That morning started like any other. The air was crisp, and dew clung to the grass as Jonathan carried his coffee to the edge of the field, but as he stepped out he noticed something unusual. The soft hum of morning birdsong was overpowered by the grating noise of heavy machinery. He froze, his eyes scanning the horizon until he saw a fleet of construction vehicles tearing into the far side of his property. Workers in hard hats barked orders to each other as cement mixers churned and bulldozers flattened the earth. Panic gripped Jonathan as he rushed toward the commotion. His boots kicked up dirt as he approached a makeshift fence hastily installed across a portion of his field. A laminated sign hung crookedly on one of the poles: future parking lot construction in progress. Behind it, large sections of his field were already being covered in concrete. "What the hell is going on here?" Jonathan shouted as he reached the fence. A foreman, clipboard in hand, barely spared him a glance. "You're trespassing," Jonathan continued, his voice rising. "This is private property. Stop the work immediately." The foreman, a stocky man with an air of indifference, sighed heavily and turned toward Jonathan. "We've got the permits," he said curtly, tapping his clipboard. "This area is designated for development as part of the neighborhood improvement plan. You need to take it up with the management company." "Improvement plan? What are you talking about?" "This is my land," Jonathan shot back, pointing to the ground beneath their feet. The foreman shrugged. "Not my problem. We're just following orders." He gestured for the workers to keep going and turned his attention back to the clipboard, as though Jonathan didn't exist. Fury and disbelief coursed through Jonathan. He stepped closer to the construction site, his fists clenched, but another worker stopped him, warning him to stay back. He knew he wasn't going to get answers here, so he stormed off toward his house, heart pounding. Inside, Jonathan pulled out the thick folder of documents he had inherited with the field. It contained everything: the original deed, maps, and proof of ownership that clearly marked the boundaries of his property. As far as he could tell, there had been no changes to his title, no sales, and certainly no agreements to allow construction. His land was untouched and legally his. Still, the workers had spoken with such certainty about their permits. He decided to head directly to the nearby management office for answers. By the time he arrived, Jonathan's anger had been replaced by a cold resolve. He marched into the pristine lobby, where a receptionist greeted him with an overly cheerful smile. "I need to speak with someone about the construction happening on my land," Jonathan said, his voice firm. The receptionist hesitated. "Do you mean the parking lot project?" "Yes," he snapped. "It's happening on my property, and no one informed me or asked for my permission. I want to know who authorized this." The receptionist's smile faltered. She gestured toward a glass-walled office in the back. "You'll want to speak with MS. Carolyn Fields. She's the project coordinator." Jonathan strode past the desk without waiting for an invitation. Inside the office, Carolyn Fields sat behind a sleek desk covered with neatly stacked papers. She looked up, her bright smile unnerving in its precision. "Mr. Hadley, I presume." Jonathan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Why are there workers pouring concrete on my land without my consent? This is illegal." Carolyn tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "I assure you, Mr. Hadley, everything is being handled within the boundaries of the law. That land was included in the recent rezoning initiative passed by the community board. It's now part of the neighborhood's jurisdiction." "That's impossible," Jonathan retorted, slamming his folder of documents onto her desk. "This is my property. It's been in my family for decades. No one has the right to touch it." Carolyn calmly opened the folder, flipping through the papers with an air of disinterest. "These documents are Outdated, she said finally, sliding them back toward him. The rezoning adjustments were finalized earlier this year. Notifications were sent out, and no objections were filed. I didn't receive any notifications, Jonathan countered, and even if I had, I wouldn't have agreed to this. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening with false sympathy. I understand this is upsetting, but the project is already underway. If you'd like, we can discuss compensation. The management company is willing to offer a generous settlement to avoid any further complications. Jonathan bristled. Compensation? This isn't about money. You can't just take my land and cover it in concrete. Carolyn's smile tightened, and for the first time, her tone turned cold. Mr. Hadley, I suggest you consult a lawyer if you feel there's been a misunderstanding. But I assure you everything is above board. Continuing to disrupt the project will only create unnecessary difficulties for both of us. Jonathan stared at her, a mix of anger and disbelief knotting in his stomach. He realized that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was calculated. The company knew exactly what it was doing and didn't expect him to fight back. Without another word, he grabbed his documents and left the office. As he stepped outside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The number was unknown, but something compelled him to answer. You don't know who you're dealing with, a distorted voice said. Don't trust what they tell you. Look deeper. Before Jonathan could respond, the line went dead. Standing alone in the parking lot, his heart pounding, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to be a simple fight. Jonathan Hadley drove home in silence, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The encounter with Carolyn Fields had left him shaken and furious. Her smug attitude, the dismissive way she treated his ownership of the field, and the veiled threats about unnecessary difficulties all pointed to one thing: this wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight or a minor zoning dispute. Someone was deliberately trying to take his land, and they weren't even trying to hide it. The distorted phone call earlier only deepened his unease. Someone clearly knew more than they were letting on, but who? And why was his field suddenly so important? When he arrived home, he found a thick envelope wedged into the gap of his mailbox. His name was scrawled on the front in bold, impersonal letters, but there was no return address. Unease prickled at the back of his neck as he ripped it open. Inside were photocopies of legal-looking documents, along with a typed letter that read, Mr. Hadley, as per the rezoning initiative finalized earlier this year, your property is now under the jurisdiction of the Neighborhood Board. Enclosed, you will find all relevant paperwork confirming the legality of the parking lot project currently underway. Please refrain from interfering further, as doing so may result in legal action. Sincerely, Carolyn Fields. Jonathan sifted through the papers, his eyes scanning for anything that made sense. Maps, zoning documents, a supposed public notice about the changes. All of it looked polished and official at first glance. But the more he studied them, the more inconsistencies he found. The maps were blurry and lacked proper stamps or signatures. The dates on the zoning documents conflicted with each other, and the supposed notice was laughably vague, with no clear addresses or contact information. Jonathan's anger burned hotter as the realization hit him these weren't legal documents, they were fakes. Someone was trying to bully him into submission with poorly cobbled-together lies. He immediately called his lawyer, Stephen Miller, a no-nonsense property attorney who had helped him finalize the paperwork when he inherited the field. Stephen picked up on the second ring. Jonathan, he said, his tone brisk. What's going on? They're building a parking lot on my land, Jonathan said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. They're saying it's part of some rezoning initiative, but the documents they gave me don't add up. I think they're fake. Stephen was silent for a moment before replying. I'm coming over. Don't do anything rash until I've seen the paperwork. True to his word, Stephen arrived less than an hour later, his briefcase in hand and a determined look on his face. Jonathan spread the documents out on the kitchen table, walking him through everything that had happened, from the sudden construction, to the meeting with Carolyn Fields, to the threatening phone call. Stephen listened carefully, his sharp eyes scanning every page. These are garbage, Stephen said bluntly. tossing the supposed zoning documents onto the table. There's no official seal, no signatures from the county registrar, nothing to indicate that these hold any legal weight. I've seen better forgeries from high schoolers trying to fake their parents' signatures. So what do we do? Jonathan asked, his voice tight with frustration. Stephen leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. First, we're going to file an emergency injunction to halt the construction. That'll at least buy us some time to dig into this properly. Then, I'm going to pull the official records for your property and the zoning changes they're claiming. If there's anything even remotely legal about this, it'll be on file with the county. Jonathan nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope. What about the workers? They're still out there. They're not going to stop just because I tell them to. Stephen's expression darkened. They'll stop once the injunction goes through. If they don't, they'll be in violation of a court order, and we can escalate things from there. In the meantime, keep your distance. Don't engage with them directly, it'll only complicate things. The next morning, Stephen filed the injunction, and by midday, a court order was issued to temporarily halt all construction on Jonathan's land until the matter could be resolved. Armed with the paperwork, Jonathan returned to the field, his heart pounding as he approached the construction site. The noise of the machinery had stopped, and the workers were huddled near the edge of the lot, looking frustrated. The foreman from the day before stood in the center, barking orders into his phone. Jonathan didn't wait for an invitation. He marched straight up to the foreman and thrust the court order into his face. "This is an official injunction," he said, his voice steady but cold. "You're done here. Pack up your equipment and leave." The foreman glared at him, snatching the paper and scanning it with a sneer. "This isn't over," he said, crumpling the document and shoving it into his pocket. He signaled to the workers, who began gathering their tools and equipment, but the hostility in the air was palpable. As the workers retreated, Jonathan felt a brief surge of relief. But it was short-lived. That evening, as he sat in his living room, sifting through more paperwork with Stephen, the power suddenly went out. The entire house plunged into darkness. "What the hell?" Jonathan muttered, grabbing a flashlight and heading outside. The surrounding neighborhood was lit up as usual, only his house was affected. He checked the breaker box, but nothing seemed out of place. Then he noticed the cut wires dangling from the side of the house. Stephen joined him outside, his expression grim. "This isn't a coincidence." Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "We warned you to stay out of this." His stomach churned as he showed the message to Stephen. "They're trying to scare me off." Stephen's jaw tightened. "Let them try. We're going to hit them where it hurts." Over the next few days, Stephen uncovered more damning evidence. The zoning changes Carolyn had mentioned were never approved by the county board. The rezoning initiative didn't exist anywhere in public records. Even more troubling, the management company overseeing the project had ties to a shell corporation with a long history of shady land deals. But the intimidation tactics didn't stop. Jonathan's mailbox was smashed one morning, and he found a dead bird on his porch the next day. His cameras caught glimpses of shadowy figures near his property at night, but their faces were always obscured. The final straw came when he returned home one evening to find a spray-painted message on the side of his house, "Leave it alone." Jonathan stared at the words, his fists clenched. They were escalating, but so was he. This wasn't just about his land anymore, it was about standing up to whoever thought they could bully him into submission. "Let's take this to the next level," he told Stephen the next morning. "No more playing defense. We fight back." Jonathan Hadley knew the battle was escalating. The vandalism, the threats, the shadowy figures lurking at night, whoever was behind this, was determined to intimidate him into submission. But Jonathan wasn't the type to back down. His field wasn't just a piece of land, it was part of his family, part of his life. He wasn't going to let anyone take it without a fight. With the injunction temporarily halting construction, he had some breathing room, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Carolyn Fields and her team weren't just going to walk away quietly. The first order of business was to secure the property. Jonathan installed more cameras along the edges of the field, covering every possible blind spot. He hired a local contractor to reinforce the fence, ensuring it couldn't be easily breached. He even set up motion-activated lights around his house and along the perimeter of the field. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. If they wanted to keep pushing him, he'd make it as difficult as possible. While Jonathan worked on securing the physical boundaries of his property, Stephen Miller dove deeper into the legal side of things. He spent hours at the county registrar's office, combing through public records and zoning documents. What he found was a tangled web of discrepancies, missing paperwork, and outright lies. The rezoning initiative that Carolyn had so confidently referred to didn't exist. The maps and documents she had shown Jonathan were complete fabrications, designed to look official but lacking any real legal weight. Even more disturbing, the management company overseeing the Project Northgate developments was tied to a larger corporation known for shady land acquisitions and aggressive legal tactics. "They're playing dirty," Stephen said one evening as he spread out his findings across Jonathan's dining room table. "This isn't just about your land. They're doing this all over the county, bulldozing small property owners like you to make way for their projects. They fabricate documents, push through false zoning claims, and intimidate anyone who gets in their way. By the time people realize what's happening, it's too late." Jonathan clenched his fists as he looked over the evidence. "So they think I'm just going to roll over like everyone else?" "They're betting on it," Stephen replied. "And the threats? That's their way of testing you. If you back down, they win. If you push back, they'll escalate." "They already have," Jonathan muttered, thinking of the spray-painted message on his house and the cut power lines. "What's our next move?" "We need to prove that their project is illegal," Stephen said. "If we can show the court that the zoning changes are fake and that they're building on your land without permission, we can shut this down permanently. But that's going to take time, and they're not going to wait around. They'll try to force your hand." Stephen's prediction proved correct. A few days later, Jonathan returned home to find another envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a letter from Northgate Developments, notifying him that they were filing a countersuit against him for interfering with a community improvement project. The letter accused him of blocking progress, harming the interests of the neighborhood, and causing financial damages to the company. Jonathan felt his stomach drop as he read the letter. "They're trying to flip this on me," he said, showing it to Stephen. Stephen nodded grimly. "That's standard practice for them. They want to paint you as the bad guy. Don't let it rattle you. This countersuit has no legal merit, it's just another scare tactic." But the scare tactics weren't limited to legal maneuvers. That night, Jonathan was woken up by the sound of car engines idling outside his house. He peeked through the curtains to see two black SUVs parked on the road. The headlights were off, and the windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. Jonathan's heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and snapped a picture. The cars didn't move for nearly an hour, and then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they drove off into the night. The next morning, Jonathan found fresh tire tracks leading onto his field. Someone had been there while he slept. "I'm not letting this slide," Jonathan said to Stephen the following day. "They're trying to scare me off my own land." "They want you to feel powerless," Stephen said. "But you're not. We have the injunction, and we're building a strong case against them. They're panicking, that's why they're pulling these stunts." Despite Stephen's reassurances, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. He decided to take matters into his own hands. That evening, he grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and headed out to the field. He wanted to see for himself what Northgate Developments had been doing under the cover of darkness. As he walked through the field, the cold night air biting at his skin, he noticed something strange. The concrete they'd poured wasn't smooth and uniform, it was cracked and uneven in places, almost as if something beneath it was pushing upward. He knelt down and ran his hand over the surface, feeling the jagged edges of the cracks. Whatever was under there, it wasn't natural. Jonathan decided to dig. Using the crowbar, he chipped away at the edge of the concrete, prying up chunks until he reached the dirt underneath. He worked methodically, his breath fogging in the chilly air. After nearly an hour, he uncovered something that made his blood run cold. It was a large metal grate embedded in the ground. Beneath the grate was a dark void, and from within that void came a faint, foul-smelling odor. Jonathan shone his flashlight through the gaps in the grate, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of a parking lot. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of underground storage? A waste disposal site? And why was it hidden beneath his field? He took several pictures of the grate and the surrounding area before covering it back up with dirt. The next morning, Jonathan showed the pictures to Stephen. "This isn't just about stealing my land," Jonathan said. "They're hiding something out there." Stephen studied the photos, his brow furrowed. "If this is what I think it is, they're in serious trouble. This could be a violation of environmental laws, but we'll need proof, concrete proof." Jonathan nodded. "I'm going back tonight. I need to see what's down there." Stephen grabbed his arm. "Not alone, you're not. These people are dangerous, Jonathan. If you go poking around, they're going to come after you." "They already are," Jonathan said. "I'm not waiting for them to make the next move." That night, Jonathan returned to the field with a small toolkit and a rope. He pried the grate loose, revealing a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. The foul smell was stronger now, making his stomach churn. With the rope secured to a nearby fence post, he lowered himself into the void, his flashlight cutting through the blackness. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Rusted barrels, stacked haphazardly, filled the underground space. The barrels were marked with faded symbols that looked like warnings, but the labels were too degraded to read clearly. Some of the barrels were leaking, their contents seeping into the soil. Jonathan didn't know exactly what he was looking at, but he knew it wasn't good. Before he could take a closer look, he heard the distant hum of engines. Someone was coming. Jonathan scrambled out of the shaft, replacing the grate as quickly as he could. He barely made it to the edge of the field before he saw the headlights approaching. Lying flat on the ground, hidden in the tall grass, Jonathan watched as the vehicles stopped near the shaft. Several men got out, their flashlights scanning the area. One of them knelt by the grate, inspecting it closely. Jonathan's heart pounded as he stayed perfectly still, his breath shallow. He didn't know who these men were, but one thing was clear: they knew about the barrels, and they were desperate to keep them hidden. As the men began covering the area with fresh concrete, Jonathan silently retreated, his mind racing. This wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was something much darker, and he was in the middle of it. Jonathan couldn't shake the image of the rusted barrels stacked beneath his field. The sight of the leaking containers with their faded warning labels and the foul stench that clung to the air haunted him. Whatever Northgate Developments was hiding, it wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. And now they had doubled down, covering the grate with fresh concrete to erase any evidence of what lay below. Jonathan realized he had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple land dispute, but the question remained: why here, and why now? The next morning, Jonathan sat at his kitchen table with Stephen Miller, his lawyer, and laid out everything he had discovered the previous night. Stephen stared at the photos of the barrels with a grim expression. "This isn't just a zoning scam," Stephen said, rubbing his temples. "If these barrels are what I think they are, we're talking about hazardous materials, probably toxic waste. Northgate isn't just stealing your land, they're using it as a dumping ground." Jonathan leaned forward, his jaw tight. "But why my field? Why not some remote area where no one would notice?" Stephen pointed to the old deeds and maps Jonathan had spread out across the table. "Your land is isolated, but it's not so remote that it raises suspicion. Plus, it's private property, less likely to be inspected by environmental regulators unless someone reports it. My guess? Northgate has been using land acquisitions like yours as a cover to dispose of this stuff. It's cheaper than legal disposal methods, and they probably figured you wouldn't fight back." Jonathan's stomach churned. "They thought wrong." Stephen nodded. "I'll file an additional motion with the court to include this new evidence. If we can get environmental inspectors out here, it could shut them down completely. But we need to be careful. These people aren't just running a scam, they're committing federal crimes. If they catch wind that we're onto them, they'll escalate." Jonathan didn't need the reminder. He had already experienced their escalation firsthand: the vandalism, the shadowy figures watching his house, the cut power lines. But now, with the discovery of the barrels, the stakes felt higher. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore, he was fighting to expose something potentially catastrophic. Later that day, Stephen made a series of calls to state environmental agencies, providing them with copies of the photos Jonathan had taken. The response was immediate. Inspectors promised to investigate the site, but they warned Stephen that these cases often took weeks, sometimes months, to process. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and Northgate clearly knew how to exploit that. "We don't have weeks," Jonathan muttered as he hung up the phone. "By the time they get out here, Northgate will have buried everything." That night, Jonathan returned to the field with a plan. He couldn't risk another direct confrontation with Northgate's workers or the men who had covered the barrels, but he needed more evidence, something undeniable that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial. Armed with a powerful camera, a drone, and a metal detector, he began surveying the area under the cover of darkness. The drone was a game-changer. Jonathan flew it over the freshly poured concrete, capturing high-resolution images and videos. Using thermal imaging, he detected faint heat signatures beneath the surface, likely from the barrels, which had been buried hastily and without proper insulation. The metal detector beeped wildly as he scanned the perimeter, confirming the presence of more metallic objects buried deeper into the field. But as Jonathan worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The tall grass around him rustled, though there was no wind. He froze, his heart pounding, as the faint crunch of footsteps reached his ears. He switched off his flashlight and crouched low, gripping the drone's controller tightly. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could see the outline of a figure moving through the darkness. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the silhouette. It was one of the men he had seen the night before, the one who had inspected the grate before the fresh concrete was poured. The man was carrying something, a flashlight in one hand and what looked like a crowbar in the other. Jonathan stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as the man scanned the area with his flashlight. He stopped near the spot where Jonathan had been digging the night before, crouching down to inspect the disturbed soil. Jonathan's mind raced. If the man found him, there was no telling what he might do. The tension broke when the man's radio crackled to life. A garbled voice ordered him to return to the vehicles. The man hesitated, then stood and walked back toward the edge of the field, disappearing into the darkness. Jonathan exhaled shakily, waiting several minutes to ensure the coast was clear before grabbing his equipment and retreating to his house. Back home, Jonathan uploaded the drone footage to his computer, his pulse still racing. The thermal images were damning clear evidence of something buried beneath the concrete. He sent the files to Stephen, who responded almost immediately. "This is it," Stephen said over the phone. "This is the kind of evidence that'll force the inspectors to act. I'll send this directly to the state environmental agency and loop in federal authorities. If these barrels contain what I think they do, Northgate is in serious trouble." The next day, Jonathan received an unexpected visitor. Ruth Donovan, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades, knocked on his door. Jonathan had spoken to her only a handful of times, but she looked agitated, her hands trembling as she held out an old envelope. "I thought you should see this," Ruth said, her voice shaky. "It's about your field." Jonathan invited her in and opened the envelope. Inside was a yellowed letter addressed to Ruth's late husband from a company Jonathan didn't recognize. The letter referred to an agreement to purchase a portion of Ruth's property decades ago for testing purposes. The company promised compensation but warned of confidentiality requirements. Ruth explained that her husband had refused to sell, but soon after he had been pressured by mysterious visitors who claimed the land was no longer safe. "They told us there were chemicals in the ground," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "But when we asked for proof, they just stopped coming. My husband never trusted them, and we stayed quiet. But when I heard about what's happening to you, I thought maybe it's connected." Jonathan's mind reeled as he pieced the story together. It was becoming clear that Northgate's activities had roots that stretched back years, maybe even decades. Ruth's letter was another piece of the puzzle, but it also raised more questions. What was so important about this land that companies like Northgate would go to such lengths to claim it? And how many others had been targeted? The following days were a whirlwind. State environmental inspectors arrived unannounced, armed with warrants to survey the site. Jonathan watched from his porch as teams in hazmat suits cordoned off the area and began drilling into the concrete. It wasn't long before they hit the barrels. The inspectors worked quickly, taking samples and documenting everything. But as Jonathan stood there, watching the scene unfold, a black SUV pulled up to the edge of his property. Carolyn Fields stepped out, her expression a mix of anger and feigned composure. She approached Jonathan, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel. "You've caused quite the stir," she said, her tone icy. "I hope you're prepared for the consequences." Jonathan met her gaze, his voice steady. "The only consequences here are for you and your company. Whatever you're hiding under that field is about to come out." Carolyn's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she regained her composure. "You think you've won, but this is far from over." She turned on her heel and walked back to her SUV, leaving Jonathan with the uneasy feeling that she wasn't bluffing. As the inspectors continued their work, Jonathan realized that the battle was entering a new phase. Northgate wasn't going to go down without a fight, and the discovery of the barrels was only the beginning. The discovery of the barrels had ignited a firestorm, but Jonathan quickly realized that exposing the truth wasn't going to end the fight. If anything, it only made Northgate developments more desperate and dangerous. The environmental inspector's arrival had been a victory, but it also put Jonathan in the crosshairs of a corporation that had far more resources and influence than he could have imagined. 2 days after the inspection, Jonathan's land was eerily quiet. The machinery had been removed, and the workers had vanished, leaving behind only the hastily patched concrete and trampled grass. But Jonathan wasn't naive enough to believe they had given up. He spent the morning installing additional security cameras, making sure every angle of his property was covered. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Later that afternoon, Stephen Miller called with an update. "The inspectors are taking this seriously," he said. "The initial tests confirmed the presence of hazardous materials. They've found traces of heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and even industrial waste that violates multiple state and federal regulations. This could be huge." Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. So what happens now? The state's environmental agency is preparing to issue a formal violation notice to Northgate. They'll be forced to stop all construction indefinitely and launch a full cleanup operation. But here's the thing, you need to be prepared for retaliation. They're not going to sit back and let this ruin them. "Retaliation?" Jonathan asked, though he already knew the answer. "They'll come after you," Stephen said bluntly. "They'll try to discredit you, paint you as a troublemaker, or worse. And if they think they can scare you into backing down, they'll escalate." Stephen's warning proved accurate that very night. Jonathan was jolted awake at 3 a.m. by the sound of shattering glass. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed and rushed to the living room. The front window had been smashed, and a brick lay on the floor surrounded by shards of glass. Tied to the brick was a note scrawled in bold, jagged handwriting, "Stop or else." Jonathan's pulse raced as he scanned the darkness outside, but whoever had thrown the brick was already gone. He called the police, who arrived nearly an hour later, their response tepid at best. The officer took a quick statement, shrugged, and told Jonathan there wasn't much they could do without witnesses. Frustrated but undeterred, Jonathan cleaned up the glass and reinforced the broken window with plywood. He was done relying on the police or anyone else to protect him. This was his fight, and he wasn't about to be scared off by cowards hiding in the shadows. The next morning, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Social media posts from local community groups were circulating false accusations about him. One post claimed he had illegally dumped hazardous waste on his own property to sabotage Northgate. Another accused him of being a conspiracy theorist trying to extort money from the company. The comments were even worse, filled with personal attacks and thinly veiled threats. Jonathan stared at the screen, a sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't random. Northgate was weaponizing public opinion against him, turning the community he had lived in for years into a tool for their agenda. "They're trying to isolate you," Stephen said when Jonathan called to vent his frustrations. "They want you to feel like you're alone, like everyone's against you. But the evidence is on your side, Jonathan. Don't lose focus." Jonathan nodded, but the constant pressure was wearing on him. The vandalism, the smear campaign, the lurking sense of being watched, it was enough to make anyone crack. Still, he forced himself to stay sharp. He knew he had to play smart if he wanted to survive this. The next escalation came in the form of a legal ambush. Stephen called with bad news. Northgate had filed an emergency motion claiming that Jonathan's accusations of hazardous waste were fabricated and had caused irreparable harm to their reputation. They were demanding a public apology and financial damages. "They're trying to bury you in legal fees," Stephen said. "It's a classic intimidation tactic. They know they can't win, but they're betting you don't have the resources to fight back." Jonathan gritted his teeth. "Then we hit back harder." Stephen sighed. "I'm working on it. I've filed a countersuit to dismiss their motion, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, you need to stay alert. These people don't play fair." That night, Jonathan heard movement near the edge of his property. The motion-activated lights flicked on, casting long shadows across the field. He grabbed his flashlight and baseball bat, stepping outside to investigate. Near the fence, he found fresh tire tracks and a small pile of ashes where someone had burned something. Among the ashes, he spotted a melted piece of plastic, a badge with the Northgate logo. The message was clear: they were watching him, and they weren't going to stop. The next day, Jonathan decided to take a calculated risk. He reached out to Ruth Donovan, the elderly neighbor who had given him the letter about her late husband's dealings with a suspicious company. "Do you know anyone else who might have been approached about selling their land?" he asked her. Ruth hesitated, then nodded. "There was a man down the road, Henry Marsh. He moved away years ago, but he told me once that they wouldn't take no for an answer. I don't know where he went, but I remember he mentioned having a brother in the city. It wasn't much, but it was a lead." Jonathan spent hours digging through public records and online directories until he found an address for Henry's brother. He drove to the city the next day, hoping to find answers. When he arrived, Henry's brother was reluctant to talk at first, but Jonathan's persistence paid off. Henry always said they came after him because he wouldn't sell, the man said. He found something buried on his land, big metal drums leaking some kind of black sludge. He reported it, but nothing ever came of it. Then one night his barn burned down. He said it wasn't an accident, but he couldn't prove it. That's when he decided to leave. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. It was the same pattern: intimidation, sabotage, and ultimately forcing people off their land. Northgate wasn't just building parking lots or developments, they were systematically targeting properties to cover up their illegal activities. Armed with this new information, Jonathan returned home more determined than ever. He and Stephen compiled everything they had: drone footage, thermal images, Ruth's letter, and now Henry's story. It was a mountain of evidence, enough to pressure regulators and law enforcement into taking immediate action. But Northgate wasn't done. 2 nights later, Jonathan was awoken by the sound of engines revving. He rushed to his window and saw a convoy of trucks pulling into the field. Workers began unloading equipment, ignoring the injunction and the environmental violations. Jonathan grabbed his phone and started recording, but he knew this was more than just a violation. They were trying to destroy evidence before the authorities could act. As he called Stephen and the environmental agency, the trucks roared to life again, heading straight for the area where the barrels had been buried. Jonathan's heart raced as he realized they were planning to dig everything up and haul it away before inspectors could return. Jonathan stood at the edge of his field, the baseball bat in his hand. He knew he couldn't stop them alone, but he also knew this was the breaking point. Northgate was playing for keeps, and the next move could determine everything. Jonathan stood frozen at the edge of his field, bat in hand, as the convoy of trucks moved deeper onto his land. The rumble of their engines echoed through the cold night air, and the floodlights they had mounted cut harsh beams across the trampled grass. Workers moved with urgent precision, unloading equipment and setting up near the freshly poured concrete. Jonathan's mind raced. They weren't just violating the court order, they were making a calculated effort to erase any evidence before the inspectors could act. His phone was already in his hand, and he hit record, filming everything from the safety of the tree line. The video showed the trucks, the workers, and the machinery now drilling directly into the concrete. A crane lowered what looked like a large storage container, and Jonathan's stomach turned at the realization that they were preparing to haul the barrels out. This wasn't just desperation, it was an all-out assault on his land, the law, and the truth. Jonathan called Stephen, keeping his voice low as he watched the operation unfold. "They're back," he whispered. "They're digging up the barrels right now. I've got it on video." Stephen's voice was sharp. "Stay out of their way. I'll call the inspectors and the sheriff. They're in contempt of court, and this goes way beyond a civil violation now." Jonathan hung up, his grip tightening on the bat. Waiting for reinforcements felt like an eternity, and every minute that passed was another minute Northgate's workers could use to cover their tracks. He glanced back at his house, where his floodlights shone faintly on the broken window they had smashed days earlier. The image fueled his anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. Then the sound of raised voices carried across the field. Jonathan's heart skipped. One of the workers was yelling at a man in a suit, someone who had just stepped out of a black SUV parked near the trucks. Jonathan recognized him immediately. It was Mark Willard, a senior executive from Northgate. He had seen the man's photo in the articles Stephen had dug up. If Willard was here, it meant this wasn't just another night of cleanup, this was the endgame. Jonathan crept closer, using the shadows of the trees to stay out of sight. He activated the zoom on his phone's camera and focused on Willard. The man was barking orders, gesturing furiously toward the barrels being hauled up from the ground. Even at a distance, Jonathan could see the agitation in his body language. "Get those loaded now," Willard shouted. "I don't care how sloppy it looks. We're out of time." The workers scrambled, struggling to secure the barrels, some of which were visibly leaking a dark, viscous liquid. Jonathan's stomach churned as he realized how dangerous the situation had become, not just for his land, but for the entire area. Before Jonathan could think of his next move, the roar of sirens cut through the night. Flashing red and blue lights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as they approached. The trucks hesitated, their drivers turning toward Willard for instructions. "Go," Willard barked. "Get out of here before they box us in." The trucks roared to life, and Jonathan saw two of them speed away, tires kicking up dirt as they fled down the back road leading out of the field. But before the remaining vehicles could follow, the sheriff's deputies arrived, their cars blocking the main exit. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, shouting orders for everyone to stand down. Jonathan stepped out of the shadows, heart pounding, and waved to one of the deputies. "I'm the property owner," he called, keeping his hands visible. The deputy nodded, motioning for Jonathan to stay back. Meanwhile, the workers began to scatter, some dropping their tools and making a run for the tree line. The deputies quickly moved to detain the stragglers, while others surrounded the remaining trucks. Willard stood firm near the barrels, his face pale but defiant. "This is private business," he shouted, holding up a clipboard. "We have every right to be here under emergency protocols." One of the deputies stepped forward. "You're in violation of a court-ordered injunction, and you're trespassing on private property. Drop the clipboard and step away." For a moment, it seemed like Willard might argue further, but the flashing lights and armed deputies left him no room to maneuver. He dropped the clipboard and raised his hands, his face twisting into a scowl as they placed him in handcuffs. Jonathan stayed near the edge of the field, filming the entire scene. The inspectors arrived shortly after, wearing hazmat suits and heading straight for the barrels. Jonathan watched as they carefully documented the scene, taking samples of the leaking liquid and securing the barrels to prevent further contamination. One of the inspectors approached him later, pulling off his protective mask. "You were right," the man said grimly. "These barrels contain industrial solvents, heavy metals, and God knows what else. If this stuff seeped into the groundwater, it could contaminate the entire area." Jonathan felt a mix of anger and relief. What happens now? The cleanup will take time, but this site is officially a hazardous materials zone, the inspector replied. As for Northgate, they're going to have a lot of questions to answer. The EPA will be all over this by morning. Jonathan nodded, his heart still racing as he processed everything. The field he had fought so hard to protect was now a crime scene, but at least it wasn't in the hands of Northgate anymore. By dawn, the trucks were gone, and so were the workers. Deputies escorted Willard and his accomplices away in squad cars, and the inspectors began setting up long-term containment measures. Jonathan stood at the edge of his field, watching as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. This was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. His field was scarred, the land he had loved now a symbol of corporate greed and corruption. But as he stared out at the chaos, he reminded himself that he had stood his ground. He had fought back, not just for his family's legacy but for the truth. Stephen arrived later that morning, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Jonathan corrected. "But this isn't over, is it?" Stephen shook his head. "Not by a long shot. Northgate will face criminal charges, and there's going to be a mountain of lawsuits. But they'll come back, they always do." Jonathan crossed his arms, his resolve hardening. "Let them try. This is my land, and I'm not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's field became the epicenter of a much larger story. Environmental agencies swarmed the site, conducting thorough investigations into the buried barrels and uncovering even more damning evidence against Northgate developments. News outlets picked up the story, exposing the company's history of illegal dumping, land grabs, and forged documents. The once powerful corporation now faced a tidal wave of public outrage, legal battles, and federal investigations. Jonathan watched the fallout unfold from a distance. His field was still cordoned off with yellow hazard tape, and the inspectors had set up a temporary command center near the edge of the property. Trucks filled with contaminated soil came and went as part of the massive cleanup effort. It was painful to see his land scarred and disrupted, but Jonathan took solace in knowing that the truth had finally come to light. One morning, Stephen Miller arrived at Jonathan's house, carrying a thick stack of legal documents. He placed them on the kitchen table with a satisfied smile. "Northgate is finished," Stephen said. "The EPA's report is conclusive. What they did here was not only illegal but potentially catastrophic. They're facing criminal charges and massive fines. Most of their executives are already resigning or lawyering up." Jonathan nodded, though his expression remained somber. "And my land," Stephen hesitated. "It's going to take time. The cleanup will probably go on for months, maybe longer. But once it's done, the field will be safe again. You'll have it back, Jonathan." "Safe, but not the same," Jonathan murmured, glancing out the window toward the field. Stephen placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than most people ever could. You stood up to them, and you won. That matters." Jonathan wasn't so sure. The victory felt hollow. His field, once a sanctuary of peace and connection to his family's past, was now a symbol of the battle he had fought. But as the days passed, Jonathan began to see glimmers of hope. Neighbors who had once believed Northgate's lies began reaching out to apologize. Ruth Donovan stopped by to thank him personally, tears in her eyes as she handed him a small framed photograph of her late husband standing proudly on their own field years ago. "You fought for all of us," she said. "Don't ever forget that." The community, once divided by Northgate's manipulations, started to rally around Jonathan. Local volunteers offered to help repair the damage to his house, replacing the broken window and repainting the vandalized walls. Others brought food and supplies, small gestures of solidarity that reminded Jonathan he wasn't alone. One afternoon, as Jonathan stood at the edge of the field, he noticed the first signs of life returning. Grass had started to push through the disturbed soil, and birds were nesting in the nearby trees again. It would take time, but nature was healing. Despite the small victories, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Northgate was crumbling, but the system that had allowed them to operate for so long remained intact. If it wasn't Northgate, it would be another company, another fight. The final reminder came in the form of a letter delivered by courier late one evening. The envelope was unmarked, and inside was a single piece of paper with a simple message. "You won this round. Next time you won't." Jonathan stared at the note, his jaw tightening. It was a warning, a taunt, and a promise all at once. But instead of fear, Jonathan felt something else: resolve. He walked out to the field and stood beneath the fading light of the setting sun. The battle had taken its toll, but it had also shown him his strength. This land was his, and no matter what threats came his way, he would protect it. As the breeze rustled through the grass, Jonathan made a silent vow he would rebuild. Not just his field, but the trust and peace it represented, and if anyone tried to take it from him again, they would learn the hard way just how far he was willing to go.